Hopefully you'll remember from earlier in the semester work that I provided to you called The Dimensions of Culture, which talked about the ways that cultures vary around the world depending upon whether they're individualistic or collectivist in nature. Much of the material in this rather short discussion about cultural diversity in families will be drawn some from that piece of work, as well as another resource or two that I found along the way. When we look at cultural differences among family systems, the worker has to approach each family as being very unique and having its own rules, customs, habits, values, beliefs, and behaviors. It's important for us to learn as much as we can about the cultural background of the family and to approach the family as a learner about that family's culture, as well as the various ins and outs of this particular family's system. No family fits into a mold from any culture in particular, as each family has its own set of values and rules to learn about. We must understand the values of each generation of the culture, and we must respect the practices of the family in regards to the interactions with them as we enter as an outsider. It may be useful to consider that a general approach of recognizing whether the family's culture is individualistic or collectivist in nature, and this framework can give us some general ideas about the system itself even before we enter into the system, and might prepare us better to understand some of the differences that we're going to find in terms of their expectations of us as well as each other, the boundaries that exist within the family system, the behaviors we can look for, and the expectations those individuals may have of each other. Every family presents as a unique system, as I mentioned earlier, and each person's functioning within the system and that person's response to your own intervention can be understood better by you as the practitioner if the fundamental concepts of culture mixed with the complexity of this particular family system dynamics can be understood. So let's look at cultural diversity in families along half a dozen or so different dimensions. First, individuality versus interdependence. Some families, in some cultures, children are raised to be unique and individualistic. And this is very true of the Western style of families, where we raise kids to eventually go out on their own and make their own decisions. And success is measured by the fact that the young person can stand on his or her own 2 feet. Whereas other systems and other cultures stress interdependence and conformity as something which is vital in the system itself. Rather than raising children to be independent and going out on their own, perhaps even leaving the system at some distance, some cultures raise their children with the expectations that those children will remain close to the extended family system and continue to value the importance of other members of the family and other generations in the family when making plans for himself or herself. Are persons raised to be self-reliant and to make decisions based on their own needs, or is this person expected to be loyal to others and to make the decisions based on the family's or the tribe's needs? Again, a very big difference there between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures tend to value privacy very strongly, but in many collectivist cultures, the notion of a private life is virtually non-existent. If we look at the nuclear family system versus the extended family model, in the nuclear family, we have the parents and the children in the household pretty generally, with some variations on that, of course. But in the extended family model, parents, children, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins oftentimes are even under the same roof, if not very, very close by. This is not unusual at all for families that come from cultures that are less westernized in their style. In this family system, are the parents the ultimate decision makers, or are children raised to make the decisions for themselves? Or are many persons in the family system involved in deciding major issues? For instance, in many cultures, the elders are the ones that the family turns to make choices for everyone else in the household. In multi-generational households, does the family of procreation take precedence, or does the family of origin rule? In other words, in Western societies, the family that we create, our spouse and our children, are the ones that generally are expected to be primary in our decision-making process and in our hearts and minds, so to speak. Whereas, again, in other cultures, the family of origin and the needs of that extended family often rule in the decision-making. In Western-style families, the younger generations will make their own decisions, at least as they go out on their own. But in more traditional family systems, the oldest male generally is the one who has the ultimate authority. And sometimes, in some cultures, grandmothers are instrumental in making decisions about particular areas in the family, particularly about healthcare and about what goes on in the home. An example of multi-generational households and elders having ultimate responsibility would be the Amish family, where oftentimes as the youth in the family grow up and marry, rather than going out and building their own homes in some more traditional Amish families, an extension is built onto the home, and the new family lives in the same building as the parents' family does, so to speak. And in that household, the elder in the family is the one that makes the decisions, so the young marrieds continue to defer their decisions to the elder. Another way to look at cultural diversity in families involves role flexibility and kinship. Is the kinship structure mostly bilateral in nature? That is, relationships are considered to be important from both the patrilineal and matrilineal lines? Or is family membership more traced through the male or female ancestor primarily? Some unilateral cultures, for instance, are patrilineal, others are matrilineal, involving both property and privilege. Alaska Native cultures and many Native American cultures have a matrilineal quality and importance to them, as a matter of fact. Is it uncommon for grandparents to assume a caretaker role in the household, or is it commonplace for grandparents or aunts and uncles to assume the parental role as children's parents leave the home, go to work, or have issues or problems, or just move out and leave their children to be raised by the older generation? In some cultures, this is much more prominent and common than in others. This is not to be seen necessarily as a defect in the structure of the family system when you consider the cultural implications of these decisions. Family dynamics in acculturation are going to look different from one family to another, and it depends on a number of different things. With immigrant families in particular, has the family been in the country for generations? And if so, the family dynamics, certain areas that we've already discussed, for instance, are going to probably be more in tune with the Western model of families. But if the family has recently migrated, then the dynamics are going to seem to be quite different. Migration often results in a loss of parental status and intergenerational conflict and communication problems for reasons that we're going to touch on here in a second. Are parents able to function as the primary communicator with the outside world? And this is the case, generally speaking, in the Western style of families. Or are the children more adept at the language and thus oftentimes functioning as the interpreters for the parents in the family system? This can result in feelings of shame for parents and even a betrayal of the family if the children communicate personal information to those outside the family. Oftentimes, these family issues are meant to be kept within the family system, and as children adapt to the Western style of reaching out to persons outside the family system, this can create a lot of issues within the family. Do the parents recognize and practice Western parenting techniques, or do they continue to use traditional child-rearing methods? Sometimes the types of discipline in other cultures are very different from Western-style discipline and can bring the family into conflict with child protection agencies and social service agencies in society. Are children's wishes solicited in decision-making, and are interactions mutual, or are the children expected to respect authority of parents and to stay to themselves? Even within typical Western-style family structures, oftentimes parents may have an authoritarian approach, and other parents may have more of an authoritative approach where input from the children is solicited in the decision-making process. This is differentiated between socioeconomic classes. Working class families tend to have more of an authoritarian approach to raising their children, whereas families that have more education, higher education, oftentimes lean more towards the authoritative style where they engage the children in rule-making and decision-making within the family system. Families from traditional societies tend to lean more towards authoritarian style as well, where parents' decision is the ultimate decision. In some cultures, children are expected to interact with their parents, sometimes in mutual relationship patterns, and other times in a top-down kind of relationship pattern, but nonetheless have regular interactions with parents. And there are other cultures around the world where the children really are to stay to themselves and not interact so much with parents. I saw this with a Chinese exchange student that I had with me for a year. He often stayed to himself in his room, and I learned from other exchange parents that year that were raising children from China that it's not an uncommon pattern, that the children just don't interact with parents in a casual kind of way like American parents tend to expect their children to interact with them. There are many different things that come into play when we look at family systems, and a good place to start is to figure out where it is this family has come from and what their cultural expectations are about family structure. It can be argued that there isn't any such thing as a typical family in American society any longer, but the expectations of our culture about parenting and family life are still fairly clear in many ways, and it represents something of a contract with society. As I mentioned earlier, when families from other cultures come to the United States, in the adjustment process sometimes, the varying techniques for instance, supervision and discipline can bring them into conflict with child welfare systems. And so it's something that is helpful to understand as you interact with families from other parts of the world. It can be expected that families from traditional cultures, particularly those who are relatively new to the United States, may value collectivist notions more so than those who have been in the United States for longer periods, and might display family structures and patterns that are very different from the kinds of middle-class family models that we're used to, the Western European models of families. Members of older generations are going to be more attached to the ways of the former culture. The younger generation are likely going to be reaching more to become assimilated into American life, and this, as you might expect, will create conflict within the family. The worker has to be careful to avoid depending upon the children too much to interpret for the older generations, as this can be troubling to the elders in the system and in fact be very disrespectful of the structure of the family system that is supported by that particular culture. The worker should strive to learn as much as possible about the family's culture before engaging in work with the family system and apply that knowledge as much as possible. But in the end, remember approaching families from different parts of the world and different cultures as a learner. And if we make mistakes as we enter into those family systems, to acknowledge those mistakes, make appropriate apologies for them, and move forward with the new knowledge that you've gained from this interaction. Thank you.